Good day, subscribers. Welcome back to the Contrarian, everyone. My name is Logan Moody. I love to talk about investing in the markets and just everything interesting that tends to come up in those spaces. And one question that I have kind of been pondering recently, and I've seen a few other people talking about this as well, is the AI energy push kind of an excuse to actually revamp and build new nuclear reactors and to expand the energy supply using nuclear power? And I believe the answer, increasingly so, is yes. And I'll get into this, in terms of why it may have taken artificial intelligence and that kind of whole narrative to kickstart nuclear power again. I'll kind of nerd out a little bit on the whole nuclear power area because it's definitely something I've researched quite a bit and just I find very interesting. I personally believe that nuclear is kind of the next realm in terms of where energy generation needs to come from. Of course, there's the concern about the environment and, just the degree to which fossil fuels negatively impact the environment. And, while I myself might not be on the bandwagon saying that, we have to go to renewable energy by a certain year or not, I mean, it's just undeniable that, in terms of the overall impact of a specific source of energy, nuclear by far is the lowest, and it's actually much lower than solar or wind or a lot of these other so-called green energies that really aren't that green when you look at the entire lifespan of a wind turbine or of a solar panel or things like that. So, my personal view, I guess right off the bat, is that nuclear is the next major source of power generation that humanity will need to turn to. And it's almost like we are kind of having to relearn this lesson. I think after Chernobyl and the 3 Mile Island disasters and then Fukushima, those are kind of the three main nuclear scares that have occurred with regards to nuclear power reactors coming very close to causing harm. Although in all three of those instances, actually, you really cannot find people who actually were killed as a result of these accidents happening. Whereas, if you look at wind turbines or dams or coal, power plants or anything like that, you're always going to find an example of a dam that breaches and there's thousands of people that are killed as a result. So, I mean, if you're looking in terms of overall fatalities versus power generation, nuclear is actually one of the safest, if not the safest, way to generate power. And it's just regulated so heavily at this point, at least in the United States, that it's extremely difficult to construct new nuclear reactors. And, those that do exist are kind of being phased out at this point in time. And, some of that does make sense. The original light water reactor nuclear technology is somewhat lacking, and it could be said that building new kind of small modular reactors would actually be much more efficient with using the uranium as opposed to a lot of these older light water reactors. But now kind of getting into the question that I originally posed of, is artificial intelligence and the whole need for electricity kind of an excuse to restart nuclear power? I think it kind of is being, that kind of narrative is beginning to unfold because, I've seen several headlines in the last month, or the last few weeks anyways, saying how Microsoft, Google, and Amazon at this point have all turned to nuclear energy to fuel their artificial intelligence data centers and everything like that, because these data centers are massively energy intensive. And so Microsoft, Google, and Amazon really cannot turn to something like solar or wind or an energy source like that, that not only is it very expensive, but it's not dependable. And nuclear offers a solution to both of these issues. It is both cost effective when done on a large scale, and it's also dependable. You can control a reactor. You cannot control a field of wind turbines. I mean, it's dependent on the wind actually blowing. And so, it's really interesting to see all these big companies, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. I mean, they have the the revenues of some small countries. I mean, they are very powerful organizations, and so it does appear like these companies are somehow able to, kind of get around a lot of the hurdles that would otherwise be in place if, for example, it wasn't this big tech, you know, field of giants going back to nuclear power. If it was just maybe a few startups here and there trying to build their designs of small modular reactors, at least so far, this has not been successful. They really have not been able to get through the NRC, the National or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, just with how extremely, cumbersome all of these regulations are at this point. I mean, it's made it to the point where you really cannot build a new nuclear reactor. I mean, I think in the last 20 years, one nuclear reactor was built in Georgia, and it came in billions of dollars over budget because with, all of the regulations and everything like that, if something was just a tiny bit off from spec, I mean, you'd have to tear it down and rebuild the entire thing, and it just became so insane that no power company would choose to do this on their own, except it seems like if you actually need a breakthrough in energy, you need a lot of energy being supplied to data centers, which, wind and solar really cannot do. And I think if Google and Microsoft were to try to build, coal-fired plants or even gas plants, I think that might anger some of their supporters, those that like to think that these companies are going green. And so, I'm just reading from an article right now that I saw. And last week, Google announced a deal with nuclear startup Kairos Power, buying 500 megawatts of electricity from 7 small modular reactors that have yet to be built. And just a few days ago, Amazon struck a similar deal with the startup X Energy. And I've looked into Kairos Power and X Energy, and it's just really interesting. Both of those are startup nuclear reactor technology companies. They're both developing different designs with small modular reactors. If you want to look into all of the details, you definitely can, but essentially these startups are developing small modular reactors that are smaller than what a light water reactor, kind of a traditional nuclear power plant would be. So they're generating less power, all in all, but in a much safer manner. So they're usually not using water as a coolant, and so they're usually not operating at extremely high pressure. Therefore, you're not really getting the ability for this reactor to have an explosion and release radioactive waste. I mean, if it were to melt down, it would be very contained. And basically, X Energy and Kairos and other startups are really trying to alleviate a lot of the safety concerns with nuclear power, and they're actually able to produce nuclear energy in a much more efficient way, using a lot more of the energy within the uranium. I mean, these older light water reactors, you can really only use the fuel down to a certain level, at which point you have to replace all of the uranium in the fuel rods, and as a result of that, you end up with a lot of the storage concerns of all of this nuclear waste. Whereas in theory, there's actually still a lot of energy in the nuclear waste. I mean, that's why it's dangerous. If you can develop actually some, small modular reactors that are designed to use this lower concentration of fuel, in theory, you could then kind of almost have a free fuel source for your power plants if you're able to use nuclear waste from these older reactors to fuel your newer power plants. So, I mean, Microsoft, Google, and now Amazon, they've all essentially agreed to back X Energy and Kairos Power to help them build these power plants, and then they've essentially, assured them that they will purchase power from these power plants to power their data centers and everything like that. So, it's really interesting just to see this whole trend. I think it's encouraging from the standpoint of seeing nuclear energy be kickstarted again. I mean, it is kind of, as I've detailed, I do wholeheartedly believe that it is the kind of next realm into which humanity needs to derive power from. I mean, we've kind of been burning coal and fossil fuels for quite a while. Not to say that those power sources are going to go away entirely, but especially when you look at kind of the reindustrialization of the developed world and then the industrialization for the first time of many under and undeveloped countries. I mean, you could really do that feasibly with small modular reactors. If you tried to do that with fossil fuels, you could run into some issues eventually. And of course, eventually you do run into the issue of just having them be more and more difficult to come by and running out of a limited resource. And I mean, nuclear energy, for all intents and purposes, is a lot more plentiful. Yeah, in theory, you do kind of eventually run out of uranium, but we are a ways away from that, especially if we can kind of use, nuclear waste that we currently have as fuel for these reactors. So I thought it was a really interesting just thing to observe out there in the marketplace right now that, nuclear energy appears to be making a comeback. Of course, under Trump administration, I think it will be more friendly to nuclear power. Trump, of course, is, behind the fossil fuel industry as well. But I think just with the unregulation, the deregulation aspect of his administration will be very helpful. I mean, that is what is hindering nuclear power right now. So, to put it simply, I'm very bullish on nuclear power. I don't have any real investments in this space personally, but, as a commodity, I think uranium just has, as evidenced by all of the, things I've just looked at, it seems like demand for uranium is probably going to increase in the coming future, not decrease. There's only really so far that solar and wind can get us. And I think nuclear really provides just a dependable base power source that is clean, that is dependable, and that can be very, very safe. So I do think that Microsoft, Amazon kind of see what is coming. They see what is the obvious direction, whereas other people might not necessarily see that yet. So, really it'll be interesting to see in the coming months and years as demand really gets picked up in terms of power. Of course, trying to add data centers to everything, in the whole mix of the grid and everything, it just takes up a lot more demand for power. And so you have to add a lot more power generation, of which it looks like nuclear is going to be a component of that. So I would love to know what all of you think about this in the comment section below. To my question of, is AI being used as an excuse to build new nuclear power? I'd love to know what you think about all of this, and I hope to see all of you again at some point.